I am Joe Nassise, and this is the story behind my stories.
You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
J.T. Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Thor,
Corey Dr. O,
Brandon Sanderson,
Robin Hahn,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Charlene Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is
Joe Nassise.
Hey, dear listeners, thanks for joining me today for my awesome interview with author Joseph Nassise. Before we get started, I just wanted to warn you that we had a microphone failure, and my side of the audio is not great, but of course Joe's is, and as you should expect from our guest, he's coming in loud and clear. So just want to give you a little warning before we get into today's show. Hey, authors. You need an editor in your life, and not just an editor, but an editor that understands you and gets what you're trying to accomplish. That's why you need to visit my good friend Scott Woodley at marlowemoss.net and let him take a look at your work. He'll give you a free sample edit. Scott can help you be the best writer you can be. Visit him at marlowemoss.net. Inspired sentences and polished paragraphs for print-worthy books at competitive rates and always on time. Offering a full range of editorial and ghostwriting services to self-published and traditionally published authors. Turn your ideas into words and see your dreams become books. On the right-hand sidebar of the website at hankgarner.com, you can find links where you can subscribe to the show, and it helps other people find the show. The more people subscribe, the higher we go in the rankings, and the easier people find us. I'd like to thank some sponsors this week for helping us bring the show to you. I, your humble host, have a brand new book out. It's called the Pandora Codex. Oliver Weber, Book 1, A Closely Guarded Secret, a Stolen Artifact, and a Madman Trying to Open a Portal to Hell. Can Oliver Weber become the hero he's meant to be? Pick up the Pandora Codex now. It's the first book in the Oliver Weber series. The second book, Jacob's Ladder, comes out very soon. Go ahead, dig into this series. Grab it now. You won't be disappointed. My friend Patricia Gilliam has a new series called Series Craft 101, and she has a series of books, the Fictional Character Creator Workbook, Setting and World Building Workbook. If you are looking to put together a long-running series like Patricia has done, these are some things that she's learned and that she can help you to get on top of that makes managing a long series much easier. Go check it out. There's a link in the show notes, and we'll be talking about it more. Bocara Brumley has a new book called Imani Earns Her Cape. It's a middle grade novel. You might have heard us talk about it on the show just a week or so ago when Bocara was on. 12-year-old Imani should be celebrating the most important day of her life by eating myrfruit, casting flying spells, and laughing with her mother, but there's just one massive problem. Her mother's been kidnapped by a giant troll, and now Imani is lost in the Fey realm with no way home back to Virginia. Completing her rite of passage alone is inadvisable, but if Imani doesn't want to lose the only family she's ever had, she may have no choice. Transportal train travel, underwater cities, submarines, sea dragons, and unexpected family all combine in Imani Earns Her Cape. Thanks for listening to the show. At the end, as always, we have an audiobook clip from my friend Richard Gleaves, the Jason Crane series. Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm really excited to have one of my favorite authors on, Joe Nassise. I really love his series, the Templar Chronicles, and through that series, I've got to know all of his other work. Joe has a metric crap ton of books out. I think that's the technical term. And I'm really excited to have you on the show today, Joe.
Hey, it's my pleasure to be here, Hank. Thank you very much.
Well, Joe, we begin each show with the same question, and that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or a storyteller?
That's an interesting one because my beginning is very abnormal for the way most writers start out. I wrote my first novel in college on a dare to win a case of beer. So I had no desire to be a writer. I'd read something that I really couldn't stand. I'd thrown it against the wall, wouldn't stop complaining about it. So my roommate bet me that I couldn't write anything novel length, and a case of Bass Ale was up for grabs. So I spent the next 4 or 5 months writing longhand on legal pads. I wrote my first horror novel. And then that went into a box for 11 years until my wife found it and decided that I should try to publish it. So my first memory of wanting to be a writer was only related to winning that case of beer. After that point, once Simon & Schuster bought that first novel, then everything changed for me, and I decided, hey, maybe I have some skill at this, so maybe I should try to pursue this. And here we are 18 years later, and I'm still doing it.
That's such an awesome story. I think out of, let's see, today we have episode 365 up. So out of 365 interviews, I think you're the third person to tell me that they started writing on a bet. But you're the first person that the bet was over a case of beer. So that's breathing rarefied air for sure.
It makes an interesting origin story. I'll say that.
I love it. I absolutely love it. What did you pursue? If you said it was 11 years later when your wife found that manuscript, what were you doing in the intervening time?
I was working in sales. I worked for a major technology company doing design for insurance software platforms.
So exciting.
And had been doing that from, really interesting, deep, different, exciting stuff here. I stayed in sales for a couple more years. I sold a couple more books, and then finally back in, I guess it was 2004, 2005, I finally kicked the day job to the curb and started writing full-time.
You said that you had no interest in being a writer until that dare. But were you a bookish kid when you were growing up? Did you read a lot?
Oh, yeah. I'm blessed with the ability to read very quickly. I read about 200 pages an hour. So I'll devour, even now, 6 to 12 books a week. And I read across multiple genres and, really just whatever strikes me at the time. But I've been that way since I was young. So I've been a voracious reader. I've been interested in story in general, whether it was film or TV or books. Story has always fascinated me. But I never thought to apply that. I never thought to take that interest and turn it into being a writer until, obviously, much later in life.
Did any thought go into that first manuscript that you wrote being a horror? I think you said it was a horror novel that you wrote first.
Correct.
Yeah. Did you, was that just natural, or did you think, this would be easier? Or?
Growing up, I used to watch those Saturday matinee films, Creature Double Feature on Channel 56 in Boston, and it was always, some Saturday matinee horror film. And so I was just trying to replicate that. The book Riverwatch is about a winged reptilian creature that terrorizes a small Vermont town. And in writing it, I probably broke every rule that you could possibly break as a new writer. I had absolutely no idea what I was doing. So I just kind of wrote to entertain myself. And I worked in college, I worked security. So I would sit in a little booth on the corner of campus from midnight to 8 a.m. a couple nights a week, and with absolutely nothing to do but sit there. That's mainly when I would write my novel. So, I just wrote it to, A, keep myself awake, and B, entertain myself in the process. And eventually somebody happened to like it, and it ended up, my first book was nominated for both the Bram Stoker Award and the International Horror Guild Award, and it was that book that was written to win the beer. So somewhere along the line, I must have learned something about story. That's all I can say.
well, obviously, and the old adage is there's two real tools that you need to be a writer, and you need to read a lot. And you need to write. Those are really the only two things that you need to be a writer.
Yeah.
And practice makes perfect, but so does reading, and reading a lot. You learn, the cadence of how things should sound, and just how to tell a story. So, several people have told me that they come to, or most people say that they come to writing later in life, but there's always that root of loving story early on. that you could always trace it back to.
Yep. Yeah, my father gave me books when I was a kid. Like when I was 10, he introduced me to the Lord of the Rings and Edgar Rice Burroughs' John Carter and Tarzan series. And so, I had an interest back then in just diving into those worlds. And it was only later that I decided, hey, maybe I can actually create worlds like this myself. So,
you have written really prodigiously across a couple of different genres. Horror. I could definitely see those threads through your catalog, but also urban fantasy, which can have some. It could definitely be informed by horror, but it's kind of this other thing. How did you come to urban fantasy after beginning with horror?
Well, urban fantasy is typically defined as, fantasy set in an urban environment. So, the classic one that most people know is Jim Butcher's Harry Dresden series, this wizard in Chicago, And I had fallen into reading those early on. I had started reading Laurel K. Hamilton's Anita Blake series when that first came out. So some of these books that kind of define the genre were things that I found interesting. So my work in horror kind of started moving in that direction, more supernatural thriller rather than out-and-out horror. I find I'm more comfortable there. It gives me more room to explore. I like that environment a little better. So that's where I've kind of camped out for the last 15 years, and the majority of my work is in that genre, as you noted. Between my Templar Chronicles series, this last year, 2017, I worked with 11 other writers to do a series called the Vale Knights, which is a modern retelling of the King Arthur myths set in L.A. So again, that's, even urban fantasy there, a little more on the fantasy side, but still urban oriented. So it just happened to be something that I like to read, and therefore, if I like to read it, I tend to like to write it.
I really hate that the genre has been tagged urban fantasy because there's so much more to it than it takes place in an urban setting.
Yeah,
it's really unfortunate that that's the label that stuck. And yes, that most of those are urban settings, but I think that it's so much more than that. What is it for you that excites you about telling these fantastic stories? But in a modern setting, maybe that's one better way to describe it. With modern people, modern settings, but still holding on to this idea that in our increasingly mundane world, there's something more going on behind the scenes.
Yes. And that's really the key for me, the idea that if you peel back the veil or push back the veil, there's something else there that we don't normally see. And that is the major theme that underscores the vast majority of my work. I guess the other one might be redemptive stories, stories of these almost anti-heroes who find their way back to the light or find their way back to, being a useful member of society, so to speak. If you look at my Jeremiah Hunt trilogy, that was, Jeremiah is a complete jerk at the beginning of the book, purposely designed that way to try to make readers like or find empathy with an unlikable character. But at the same time, it's a redemptive story. If you look at my Templar Chronicles series, it's all about Cade and his, anger at what has happened to him and what kind of man that made him into, and where that goes and how he grows and changes across the, I don't know what it is now, 9 books so far, something like that. So, those are 2 major themes for me: that peek behind the veil and the path to redemption.
Tell me about the Templar Chronicles, because that's how I discovered you and how I got to love your work, was through that series. Because urban fantasy, that you also hint at, an ancient conspiracy, I am all in. So tell me where the idea for that came from, and who were the characters that matter to the readers in that.
Sure. The Templar Chronicles is essentially the story of the Templar Knights in modern times. The basic concept was, in the middle of World War II, they were kind of redeemed by the church and brought forward to be man's defense against the supernatural. So they're this paramilitary force that exists in modern times, under the radar. Nobody really knows they're there, but they're the ones who are keeping us safe from the things that go bump in the night. So major characters, a man by the name of Cade Williams. He survived an attack by a fallen angel that killed his wife, scarred him kind of body and soul, and gave him kind of unique abilities that he uses throughout the books. And it's his search for this fallen angel, the adversary. It's his search for vengeance that primes that first book, which is called The Heretic. Originally, it was going to be a 3-book series. It was published by Simon & Schuster back in 2003 or 2005. I can't remember which. But they only did one book. Simon & Schuster only did one book because about a week before the book came out, my editor left to go to Random House to do editing on cookbooks. So I was left with what they call orphaned. You know, you don't have an editor, you don't have an internal champion. And the book didn't do very well, to be blunt. However,
which is
shortly after it was, yeah, I felt the same way. Definitely a tragedy. Shortly after that, the rights were picked up by Dromer Nauer, which is a large publishing house in Germany. And over there, the first 3 books did terrifically well. They hit the Der Spiegel bestseller list. We sold hundreds of thousands of copies over there of the first 3 books. And it was interesting because I couldn't sell another book here in the U.S. because of how the Heretic looked to be a flop over here. Over there, it did gangbusters. And it was the fact that it did gangbusters over there that allowed me to come back and then continue publishing here in the U.S. Once the rights reverted back from Simon & Schuster, I continued the series myself. And since then, we've done almost 500,000 copies of The Heretic worldwide. We're in 7 different languages. The book finally found the audience that it was looking for a couple of years after it initially had come out. And I had only planned a trilogy. I was only going to do this 3-book series. And I wrote the 3, and then I kind of went on and did a few other things over the years. But fans kept writing and kept asking, when's the next book? When's the next book? How does the story continue? And I hadn't really thought about how the story continued. I mean, I'd wrapped it up with those first 3, and I was very content. But because of that interest, I went back and looked at the story again and said, okay, we're going to continue this thing. And I mapped out 3 interconnected trilogies. And then I've done some novellas in between those books. But we're closing in on the final trilogy now. The 7th book should be out soon, and then you've got the assorted novellas in between. So I've had a lot of fun with the series over the years, and I'm not sure what I'm going to do once I get to the end of book 9.
Well, your new work on King Arthur is amazing in a whole new way, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. But our friend Dan Wells, who's been on the show a couple of times, had a similar story when he began that he couldn't give books away. In the U.S., it seemed like, but in Germany, he was just monstrously huge. And, in the U.S., he co-hosts a podcast weekly with Brandon Sanderson. And you would think if anyone, had a platform to sell books, that he would just automatically have one. And it just doesn't always work that way. But, finding an audience is heartening. For sure, when your books were doing well over there, did that give you the motivation and the steam to keep it going, even though you were still trying to crack the market here?
Definitely. I went on to do 6 originals with Dromer Nauer. So they did the first 3 books in the Templar Chronicles, and then they published my Jeremiah Hunt trilogy. And, if it hadn't been for the fact that people were really digging my stuff over there, I may have turned away and done something differently, because it's really disheartening when you're trying to sell and trying to sell and trying to sell and you're not getting anywhere, particularly after I had entered the industry so easily and so quickly. It was kind of an abrupt shock to the system, I'd say, that I'd sold 3 books and then couldn't sell another for several years. But that's the way the publishing industry works. You mentioned earlier we need 2 things in order to be able to be a writer. I'd say there's a third thing we need, and that's just sheer stubbornness. You just keep getting up and doing the same thing every day and hoping that it works out. And for me, it did work out, and I'm glad I stuck with it.
I think some people could look at it as a character flaw or a mental illness, even. not to not to be flip about mental illness, but the fact that you can spend some people a year of your life or more writing a book, not sell it, put it in a desk drawer, and go to the computer and start another one. Is that's guts, that's determination, that's I don't know what it is, but yeah, you need to have that gene, whatever it is.
Yeah, the fact we sit down and stare at a blank computer screen and then come up with 100,000 words on a given theme out of nowhere definitely sets us aside from the average individual.
Absolutely. Well, Joe, let's talk about the publishing industry for just a minute, because you are a huge champion of the indie spirit, and you talked about your rights reverting back from was it Random House, and then taking your series to levels that you never did or maybe would have even been able to with a traditional publisher. What have you seen over this last decade and a half or so that you've been doing this, and or almost 2 decades, I guess, and how is it changing, and how, as an author, do you feel empowered now that maybe you never did the other route?
Sure. I started my career, Riverwatch was published in 2001. And so back then, there was no indie publishing. I guess you could go and print your own books if you wanted to do that, but that was a huge hassle, and you had to deal with stock and inventory and all that kind of crap. Never mind the financial outlay,
Right. And the label of being a vanity, author or whatever. Exactly. So, I broke into the industry the old-fashioned way, submitting query letters and all that kind of stuff. But then when indie publishing started, when Amazon came out with the Kindle in 2009, 2010, whatever it was, that fascinated me because, it meant if you were good at finding an audience, you could then write the stories you wanted to write. Pitching an urban fantasy novel to New York these days is pretty tough because New York kind of thinks that the genre has gone by the wayside, and if that's what I like to write, that's what I want to produce. And I don't want to worry that, hey, the fad is gone for New York and they won't look at it again until it, cycles back around. Everything's secular. So, at some point it's going to come back around again. But, I didn't want to deal with that. Indie publishing allows you the opportunity to write the work you want to write and reach the audience you want to reach. It certainly requires more work. I have to not only think about writing the novel, but then marketing and sustaining that marketing and watching, how the industry changes and moves and having to be fluid to change with that. But that I love. That's kind of that entrepreneurial spirit that allows me to write the material that I really want to write. And if my readers follow me, I'm hugely thankful and grateful for them doing so. It lets you kind of move out and try different things. I did it in the traditional world. I wrote primarily urban fantasy, and then I had this idea for a zombie series. And I said, okay, I'm going to write this World War I zombie series called The Great Undead War. And I did a couple books with Harper Voyager. Whether it was the time, whether it was the marketing, I don't know, but the series didn't really connect with readers the way I'd hoped. But I know for a fact if I had done that series through the indie market, I would have had much more control over how that series was marketed and would have reached a lot more readers. And when those rights revert back to me in a couple months, that's exactly what I intend to do, is to republish those books and then continue the series moving on the way I want to market it. When Harper Voyager did the series, they put out book 1 and then they waited 2.5 years before they put out book 2. That's just like eons in the publishing world in terms of catching a reader and keeping a reader. It's kind of normal for traditional publishing, but if it was done via indie publishing, it would have been a couple of months between the books, and the readers would have caught on a much easier, I think. So I think indie publishing gives you a lot more freedom. It does require a lot more dedication and focus, but it has opened up the publishing market to anyone and everyone who has a story. And if you can tell a story and you can find people who are interested in reading your story, then you can do this for decades. And that's certainly something I hope to continue doing for decades. What's crazy is a lot of genre fiction fans are like you. I mean, I think you're kind of a freak of nature that you read 6 or 7 books a week. And I mean that with all respect. And
Sure,
I read a ton, especially for the podcast. And I like to be up on what my guests are doing so that I can have an intelligent conversation with them. I think people appreciate that. And but there's if you find a genre that you really love and you find an author that you love, there's nothing worse than waiting 4 years for a follow-up book. I'm talking to you, Jim Butcher, and it's insane that they still think that a 18 months or so is a proper publishing cycle. That's absolutely insane. Because when we find something we like, we want to read all of the things. And if an author is willing to write those stories and have that relationship with us, then let's do it. What are we waiting for?
And I think that's another huge change in the industry, in the sense that things that were written 10 years ago can still be viable and earn income for an author, where in the traditional space they really wouldn't. I mean, they're no longer stocked. You can't find the books. You can only pick them up in used bookstores, that kind of thing. Where things I wrote my very first novel is still selling well for me in the indie publishing space. So that's great. That gives me so much more opportunities as a writer, because I'm not constantly trying to find that next book. The things I've written previously are still working on my behalf, so to speak.
Joe, tell us a little bit about this newer series that you mentioned earlier, the retelling of King Arthur. How did that come about, and kind of set that up for us, if you would, please?
Sure. One of my buddies in this industry is Steve Saville. We talk a lot. We write a lot of the same stuff. Okay, so Steve and I were kind of looking at a project that we could do together. And we were trying out different things, and he came up with this idea of, hey, let's do a modern retelling of King Arthur. So then we thought about it, and we thought, if we're going to do this, we really need to do it right, and it's more than just the two of us could manage. So what we decided to do was create a shared world environment, and then bring on other writers to work with us on the project. So we planned out a 12-book arc, kind of a season 1 for this story, in which, the modern-day Merlin would be introduced, and he would recruit these knights, and each knight would have a quest to go out and assemble these various artifacts, and that became our season 1. So we looked for writers who, we enjoyed, who worked in that space, who had, successful audiences, who could tell a good story. And we brought them all together and we said, okay, here's the basic outline. Now, you guys pick a night and come up with the quest story that matches the outline. And so we kind of, brought this whole thing together, and then we set out to write this thing. And our original plan was to do a book a month for 12 months in season 1. And we held to that pretty well. We got through about book 7 or 8 before we started to slow down. Life always gets in the way of the plans that you make. So we'll finish out probably by month 15 or 16 rather than month 12. We have 2 final books left in the series to release. But so far, we've done 10 of these things. Audience interaction has been great. The idea of, having a modern day Merlin who's kind of like Chris Angel, and have everything set in the U.S. versus England, it gave a little subtle change to the stories. But we brought in a lot of the elements from the original legends and made sure that they were obvious enough that people who were fans of King Arthur mythos would be able to recognize them and get it. And it's just been a lot of fun. It's interesting wrangling 12 creative minds and keeping everyone on the same track and running down the same road, which has been primarily my job throughout this process. But it's just been a joy to work on a story that I know and love and give it a spin of its own, and do it in partnership with writers that I respect and enjoy reading.
What's really unique is that you're doing this under a pen name.
Yes. So we decided early on that we would release all of the books under the name Rowan Casey, but we haven't been shy about noting, who Rowan Casey really is. It's me and Steve, it's Willie Michael, it's Lily St. Croix, C.J. Lyons, Annie Belay, Hank Schwabel, Steve Lockley, Robert Greenberger, Nathan Meyer, I'm missing someone, and Pippa DaCosta. So the 12 of us have all each written a book in the series. But one of the things we haven't done is said, okay, Joe wrote this one, and Willie wrote that one, and Annie wrote that one. We've kind of built a contest into the process where when we get to the end of all of this, we'll ask the fans, okay, tell us who wrote what. And we've got a prize selected for whoever manages to figure it all out. But it was fun doing that because it allowed us to create our own kind of entity, and not only a shared world, but a shared persona that we all worked under.
I love that so much. It's so awesome. I've read the first book, and I'm digging into the rest because the way, it's really interesting because King Arthur, I think it's a lasting myth, if you will, legend, in that it, Arthur is it brings the idea of that brings about some very definite feelings and emotion, and Arthur's connected to the physical place of England, and those those things are persistent for a reason. But being able to take those same themes and move them to the modern setting and to America really works. And I was really, I wasn't skeptical per se, but I was like, how are they going to pull this off?
Exactly.
You guys really nailed it. It's amazing. It is so much fun.
Thank you. One of the other elements we used were the 13 treasures of Britain,
Right.
So another piece of British legend, and then modernizing those. They had the hamper, and we're all looking at each other like, what the hell is a hamper? And and how do we use that? How do we turn it into something? And the horse bridle became a motorcycle, and all this kind of crazy stuff. But it still held its essential essence, and that was our goal. Could you recognize this thing if you thought about it long and hard enough? I think one mistake we made with the project that we will do differently next time around, if I ever do something this crazy again, is that each book essentially became an origin story for a different one of the knights. And so as we go through each volume, you're being introduced to a different character. And yes, all of those characters come together in the end as the Knights of the Round Table and kick off season 2 as a group. But it forced our readers to focus on a new person every single volume. And that, I think, became a little distracting. If we ever did it again, I think we would keep more characters and blend them together as the stories move on. So we're not giving you a new person to think about and remember every single time. It was an interesting process.
Absolutely. And I can't wait to see how you finish it. It's so much fun. And I love seeing authors work together and doing creative things together, because it really... when you put two creative minds together, it produces something that is more than the sum of its parts. And when you get 12 of those people together, it's just insanity. So I love it.
We had no shortage of ideas, I'll tell you that.
I'll bet. Your newest book is called Urban Enemies. It's an anthology of urban fantasy villain stories. It's got some amazing names in it. You're the editor on this, aren't you?
Correct. A couple of years back, I decided to get into that other side of the business. The first project I worked on was a collaborative project with Del Howison, the owner of the Dark Delicacies bookstore in Burbank, and Clive Barker. And what we did was we picked up Clive's novel Cabal and the film Nightbreed, and picked up where those left off and continued telling stories of these creatures that he had called the Nightbreed. And so that was a wonderful project. Cabal is a favorite of mine. Being able to play in Clive's world was terrific. But it also gave me a look into the other side of the industry. Like, okay, writing is one thing, but editing is something else entirely. And I discovered I loved it. I discovered I really liked that part of the work. And so from there, I went on to do a couple others. And the latest one is Urban Enemies. Is kind of a bookend to the one that came out before it, Urban Allies, Urban Allies was collaborative stories from popular urban fantasy series where we took two characters and stuck them together and made the writers work together to write one story. That was a joy to work on. And then we decided, well, let's do the flip side of that. You know, let's look at the villains of urban fantasy series and tell their stories. And so, you know, again, being able to work with some of the top writers in the urban fantasy field was a pure joy for me. And I think the book came out pretty well. I really like the idea that, you know, like they say, villains have all the fun, and we got to tell the story from the villain side.
Joe, I think you mentioned earlier that you're digging into the final trilogy for the Templar,
correct,
for the Templar Chronicles series. When do you see those coming out?
Initially, Book 7 was supposed to be due out at the end of 2017. We delayed it a little bit. It will probably be out next month. And then from there, the other two should follow about 4 months after each one. So I hope to be done with the final trilogy by the end of this year. I'm looking forward to seeing how fans react. You know, at the end of Book 6, there was a rather sizable cliffhanger, and things have certainly changed in the world of the Templar Chronicles when we get to Book 7. So I'm interested in how fans react to the direction I've taken it and where they're going. And of course, you know, there's been this kind of characters have been moving between series, between the Jeremiah Hunt trilogy and the Templar Chronicles series, and we'll see more of that converge and come to a close later in the trilogy as well. So tying both of those ends up is going to be really cool, and I'm looking forward to it.
Well, there goes my sleep schedule for the rest of the year.
There you go. Thanks.
Joe, this has been a lot of fun talking to you. I'm a huge fan, so thank you for taking time to come on the show today. Where can people find you online if maybe they're not familiar with your work, but they want to dig in and fall into your worlds like I have?
Sure. Website is just my name, josephnassise.com, Nassise. You can always find me on Facebook at the same place, Facebook.com/Joseph.Nassise. But, you know, I'm available on Amazon and Barnes & Noble and all the usual places if you're looking for books. So drop by the website to learn about them, and then head over to any online store or any bookstore to find some of my work.
Joe, thank you so much for taking time to come on the show today.
My pleasure, Hank. Thanks for having me. It's been a lot of fun.
Thanks for listening to the Author Stories podcast. For more great author interviews like this one, go to hankgarner.com and dig through the archives. There's something there I know you'll love. Now stay tuned for a special audio clip from Richard Gleaves' The Jason Crane series.
Hello, young one. What ghoulish tale of horror shall we explore tonight? Shall we watch The Creepshow? The Nightmare on Elm Street? Child of the night, give me your answer.
Which one would Mom kill us for watching? Said Buddy.
Dad grinned and his eyes grew wide. Which do you think, Child of the Jackal?
The Omen!
And we might have time for Omen too, if we hurry. She'll be home by 11.
I'll be back.
Buddy ran to his room. He stripped down to his Yoda underwear and fished in the closet. 2 minutes later, he snuck back into the living room wearing his skeleton costume from last Halloween. He crept up behind his dad, who was cueing the movie. But David Rittermeyer was too clever for that. He spun around at the last moment and bared fanged teeth torn from paper plates, drawing a yip of surprise and a cry of, "No fair!" Daddy kicked off his Reeboks, plopped his smelly gym socks on the coffee table, another thing that Mom would hate, and killed the lights. The scary intro music began. The screen showed the silhouette of a boy, about Buddy's age. His shadow was a long, creepy cross. The Antichrist, the son of the devil. Born of a jackal on a night of astrological portent, destined to bring about the end times and the final battle of good versus evil. Buddy sipped Sunkist and scooted up next to his dad. As the movie got scarier, he slipped an arm through his father's and cupped his big bicep. Buddy could feel his father's pulse. Dads get scared too. They flinched together, shouted together, pointed at the screen and covered their faces together. Buddy pressed his eyes to Daddy's shoulder just before the on-screen maid shouted, "It's all for you, Damien!" and dove from the roof, hanging herself. Buddy knew which parts he was old enough to watch and which parts he wasn't. He trusted his dad to let him know when to look again. Occasionally, his dad tricked him into peeking too soon, but that was part of the fun. They kicked their feet at the screen and shouted, "Look up! Look up! Oh, idiot! Don't get yourself killed!" At the climax, the hero of the movie, Mr. Thorne, discovered a birthmark of 3 6s on his son's head and dragged the little Antichrist to the altar of the church, determined to spear his son with holy daggers and end evil forever. After it was over, the Rittermeyer men sat silently through the credits. David put an arm around his son and ran his fingers through Buddy's hair. He wasn't searching for devil marks. He knew there weren't any. And Buddy was certain there were no daggers in his father's hand either. Those things were just make-believe. Real fathers and sons don't do bad things to each other. They were queuing up Omen 2 when the power went out. "No," Buddy whined. "Not on movie night." Daddy went to the window. "It's the whole block. Sorry, Damien. How about, scary blackout. Go get the Ouija board out of the guest room closet." "Cool. And candles." Buddy found the Ouija board, hidden under old clothes. When he shut the sliding door again, the sight of a monster startled him, and he let out an involuntary, "huh" sound. It was his own skeleton-bodied reflection in the mirrored closet door. He stared at it. He liked the effect of moonlight on his cheeks. Spectral, haunted, his eyes big and white. He clacked his teeth at himself, picturing his own grinning skull under his child's flesh, and gave an evil laugh. He was answered by a scream. A woman's scream. High-pitched and far away. One of the neighbors? Buddy dropped the Ouija board into a patch of moonlight and sat with it. "What's going on?" he whispered, his fingers on the heart-shaped wood planchette.